The Justice Department filed a new indictment against Wikileaks founder Julian Assange. The superseding indictment is for recruiting and conspiring with hacking groups like Anonymous.
So Assange currently faces 18 charges, but this would expand the scope of those current charges. Friend of the show and the Intercept's co-founding editor, Glenn Greenwald, joins us now to dig into the details here. Glenn, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to see you, Glenn.
Great to be with you guys.
So just break down for us what is going on and what it means.
Well, these new set of facts that are allegations, obviously unproven allegations by the Trump Justice Department, go back many years to when the Obama administration was very aggressively investigating WikiLeaks and other hacking groups like Anonymous and various hackers like Jeremy Hammond, who's currently serving a 10-year prison sentence in New York for having been found guilty of hacking. They had FBI infiltrators and informants of all kinds all over these groups. And the Obama administration was determined to try and prosecute WikiLeaks and Julian Assange as retribution for him having published the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs and the State Department cables, and found nothing that would have enabled them to prosecute him either for that publication or for any involvement in hacking. And then when Donald Trump was inaugurated and Mike Pompeo became the director of the CIA, is now the Secretary of State, he gave a speech basically saying one of our main priorities in this administration is to forever destroy WikiLeaks, not to destroy this idea that they have a First Amendment right to do what they've been doing against our government. And they've been making good on that promise, first by an indictment that was prior to the superseding one that was just released, which seeks to criminalize Assange's work with his source, Chelsea Manning, and in publishing these documents, which would essentially criminalize all investigative journalism. And now they have kind of excavated this long dead set of facts about the work that WikiLeaks supposedly did with Anonymous and others, principally regarding the huge hack of Stratford. And there's an article by Del Cameron, who's followed these events really closely, in Gizmodo, explaining why there's huge evidentiary holes, why the timeline of the Justice Department doesn't even make any sense. It's clearly just an effort to fortify the indictment, because remember, Julian is currently languishing in a prison, in a terrible prison in the UK, and they want to extradite him, and they're concerned that if they just have criminal allegations about the publishing of the materials, a British court could say, oh, this looks like a political crime. So now they're trying to make it a more pedestrian hacking crime by linking Julian to hacks that no one in the government ever, after investigating thoroughly, thought that he actually was involved in.
Mm-hmm. So, Glenn, as I understand it, the counter is that most investigative journalists don't try to incite their sources or try to teach them how to hack. Is that just spin? I mean, what's the response of Julian's defenders on that?
Well, it's really a remarkable set of events that happened from a journalism perspective, because when the Trump Justice Department announced the indictment, before they released the indictment itself, they released a press release that made it seem like they were accusing Assange of helping Chelsea Manning hack the materials that she ended up providing to WikiLeaks, as though he was helping her crack passwords and things like that. And then when the indictment was released, it turns out that none of that was true. That's not what the indictment alleges. It doesn't allege that he helped her hack into the systems of the U.S. military to get these documents. It couldn't allege that because she already had access to those systems. It wasn't like she was some outside hacker. She was in the military. She was deployed to Iraq. She had full access to those documents that she gave to WikiLeaks, legal access. She didn't need Julian's help to crack passwords in order to get them. What the indictment actually alleges is that he helped her cover her tracks, or tried to help her cover her tracks, by cracking a password that would have enabled her to use that system anonymously without being detected. And to this very day, you can talk to journalists at major papers, as I've done, who cover technology and hacking and digital security, who believe, because the Trump administration and Trump Justice Department led them to believe, that the indictment alleges that he helped her hack, and that's not what it alleges. And that's why it's so dangerous, Huggers, because even if you assume that he did what the indictment alleges, which is helped his source evade detection, every journalist in the country does that. If you look at the New York Times and the Washington Post websites today, you'll find very detailed instructions about how a source can leak to those papers without getting caught. Use encryption, circumvent this process, don't use this. If a source calls you from inside the government and says, hey, journalist, I'd like to give you a bunch of documents. The first thing you're going to say as a journalist is, hey, get off this unencrypted line, use Signal or use encrypted email in order to communicate with me. It's not just the right of a journalist, it's the duty of a journalist to help their source not get caught. That's called source protection. And that's what makes the indictment so dangerous, is it seeks to criminalize core source protection activities that all journalists do. And yes, Julian did it a little bit more in a sophisticated way because he knows how to manipulate and circumvent detection systems better than most journalists because he's more tech savvy. But the principle, the activity itself, helping a source evade detection, is the same thing.
And so the other argument that I've seen made is basically like WikiLeaks isn't a publisher. So this wouldn't apply. This journalism is safe because this is walled off thing over here, whatever it is, it's not a publisher. So New York Times, Washington Post will all be safe and good to go. Number one, does the government actually make that argument? And number two, are there any legs to that?
I mean, there's so much conflation going on. Like if you talk to the average liberal about why they're cheering for the Trump Justice Department and their prosecution of WikiLeaks, they'll typically say, oh, Julian's not a real journalist, WikiLeaks isn't a publisher, and they'll point to things in the 2016 election. And there's so many answers like, number one, the indictment has nothing to do with the 2016 election, even though that's what you're fixated on because you think Hillary Clinton is still the legitimate president. That actually has nothing to do with this case. Number two, WikiLeaks has always done the core activities of journalism. They've made decisions about what they will publish and what they won't. They redact material. They editorialize. They work with the governments around the world or corporations around the world to decide what is in the public interest and what isn't. They've worked with the biggest and most credible news outlets in the world, like the New York Times and the Guardian and El País and others around the world to publish. But here's the key point, Crystal, is that this idea that you have to first be a journalist before you can get the protections of the First Amendment's guarantee of press freedom is so authoritarian and ahistorical. When the First Amendment was first enacted, the idea of press freedoms, there was no such thing as this tiny, credentialed, professionalized class called journalism. Journalists who this cloistered profession who uniquely got to claim the protection of the First Amendment. Press freedom was an activity that all citizens engaged in. It was something that you did through the printing press to agitate against the British Crown or against corrupt officials in the colonies. And they were protecting that ability of all citizens, not just quote unquote journalists, to publish material that sheds light on what the government is doing and to agitate for a cause. It's an activity that's protected, not a tiny credentialed group of people. And you don't want to go back to or create this new standard that only journalists get the First Amendment protection, because then it becomes a question of who decides who's a journalist? What does that even mean? A lot of us are a lot of different things and then also do journalistic activities. What we want to protect is not this group of people at the New York Times and NBC News. We want to protect the activity itself, which is a crucial check on every journalist.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And then the last piece here that you kind of alluded to already, but we see lots of hand-wringing from liberals about the Trump administration's attack on the press. And it usually amounts to like calling them the enemy of the people or like excluding someone from a briefing or not doing enough briefings and those sorts of things. This is a much graver danger. And you're not hearing a lot from liberals about what is an actual attack on the press here.
I got 4 years of just like incredibly flamboyant and melodramatic and self-righteous proclamations from media outlets about how their core goal and mission is to protect the freedom of the press. The Washington Post changed its logo after Trump was elected to "Democracy Dies in Darkness" to signal that all of our journalistic spirit is devoted to this vigorous defense of the First Amendment, which will never allow anyone to infringe upon. And what they really mean, the only times they ever raise their voice in defense of those values is if Donald Trump tweets something mean about Wolf Blitzer or Jim Acosta. They care about, like protecting their friends. Here you have what is by far the greatest threat to investigative journalism. This was the model used against me by the Bolsonaro government to try and prosecute me for the journalism I did, say that when I worked with my source who hacked after the fact, or, that when I worked with him after the alleged hack, that I kind of encouraged him or counseled him into how to evade detection, and by doing that became a part of the conspiracy. It's so dangerous, not just in the United States, but to all journalists around the world. And you barely find a peep of protest from these people who have spent all these years, posturing as the brave defenders of freedom of the press that they're going to fight for to the end, because they really don't like WikiLeaks and they can't get past that. And they don't like WikiLeaks because they think that he harmed Hillary Clinton by publishing authentic materials that they all reported on. And so in the name of their ideological and political preferences, they're going to allow, apparently, the gravest attack on this value that they claim so vigorously to believe in to go unchallenged and barely denounced, because they can't get past the fact that Julian's not one of them, and therefore somehow think that the precedent isn't quite as menacing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and all roads lead back to 2016, broke a lot of people's brains, ultimately.
Yep.
By the way, people should watch System Update. Glenn was nice enough to have me on this week for a great conversation. Thank you for that, and thank you so much for being with us as always, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It was a great show. Thank you, guys. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Glenn.
Absolutely. We'll have more Rising for you after this.